Many first-generation Australian Chinese moved to Australia after the abolishment of the White Australia policy in the 1970s. The 2011 census estimates that 74.3% are first generation and 21.3% are second generation. Kira Young is third generation Australian Chinese. Her grandparents migrated to Australia from Guangzhou in the 1950s, and her father was born in Victoria in 1958. Despite coming from different generations, Kira and her father's joint passion for Chinese cultural activities has helped develop their family bond.
Yeah, so the background from our family is that my father came out here in the early 1950s, from the times in Guangzhou, being probably very poor and just hard to make a living. So he came out then. My mum came out in 1956. And I was born in 1958. So that's really where our family started here in Australia. I'm first generation, and we've been here, as you know, for a long time now, as you can understand, with my kids being born. But that's our background from Guangzhou, and out in the 1950s. Mum and Dad really came and didn't know the language, didn't have many friends, and so we lived in the West Melbourne, North Melbourne part of the city, near Victoria Market. That's where the employment was. So mostly all our friends were around that area, and that's really culturally where we came from. Oh, it's very Australian in a way, because there were a lot of migrant families. When I say Australian, not Australian as you tend to think of, white Australians, but Australian, and there was a melting pot of cultures there. We had Italians, Greeks, Maltese, and obviously Chinese. We had a lot of Chinese friends who were around that area, more migrant families like ourselves. But most of my friends, believe it or not, at that point when I was growing up, were mostly non-Chinese kids, because going to a school, King Street Primary was where we went. Where I went, and all my friends, as I say, were not non-Chinese kids. The only Chinese part of growing up was really just through my parents' friends and the people they worked with.
Growing up here.
Well, I think it's very different now. Whilst all of my kids have Australian friends, they have an equal number, if not more, Chinese Australian friends. And so from the mix, when I was young, I really had one really good Chinese Australian friend. And I think my children have many. So in a way, they've been more exposed to Chinese, I'll say cultural influences than I was when I was at their age, when young, under 10.
Yeah. They were a kid.
I don't have a whole lot of mainland Chinese friends. They're more Australian-born Chinese friends, and I don't really notice a difference between, really, because we've all been here, a while. We all associate with being Australian at the moment. That there's no real huge difference socially. Maybe with people who have come and they're the first generation over here, they sort of maybe stick to themselves a bit more, but and speak in their language. And I think that's the only real difference that I see. And there's no real difference between my Western friends and my Asian background, my Asian friends either. So I think it's all sort of plateauing a little bit between the cultures. So yeah. Well, I actually can't speak Chinese, so me and my brothers never learnt Chinese because we were given the option to go to Chinese school. We weren't forced to do it, and so I regret that now. But and so most of my friends, we all speak English with each other. I do have a few friends who they might speak, a few Chinese or in Mandarin or Cantonese together, and it's just a few maybe comments. But I haven't really experienced that lately, and yeah.
Yeah. So our involvement in Hongai Yaoshu Martial Arts School goes back a long way. So whilst I said earlier that when I grew up, I was with migrant families and Australian kids, So my parents realised, or more my mother realised, that I wasn't really associating with many people from a Chinese background. So when I was about 13, she suggested that I join Zhonghua Jiningwei, Chinese Youth Society of Melbourne, and which I did. And that was really my first main exposure to broader Chinese culture. Now, prior to that, I'd gone to Little Bourke Street and done all the things that everyone does when they're young, in terms of eating at restaurants and going to weddings and those sort of things. But in terms of being exposed to a broad group of Chinese Australians, or in fact Chinese, it wasn't until that time in 1972 that I was actually immersed in it. And through that process with CYSN, Chinese Youth Society of Melbourne, through that process of being there, I was introduced to martial arts, Chinese martial arts, introduced to lion dancing, and there was a Chinese school there, of course, as well. So it's through that, and really a long time spent practicing with that we eventually formed the Hongar Yaoshu Martial Arts School as an offshoot of CYSN, and which would continue to this day. So that's, for me, that's an association with CYSN that's spanned 40 plus years. HGYS as an entity has been around almost 30 years. We started in 1986, so that's it's a fairly long time, but that's the association with why we had this school, because of the interest that I and a group of friends had in martial arts, and specifically Chinese martial arts, a desire to spread that culture, or to keep that culture going, and a way of keeping all of our community together in terms of both our families and our friends.